Dr. William Thierfelder holds a PhD in English, but has taught a variety of arts and humanities courses over a 3-decade career at several New York and Long Island universities and colleges. After retiring from teaching in 2010, he now devotes his energy to being an artist, photographer, writer, lecturer, and museum docent. He currently resides in Portland, Oregon, and is in fact in Portland as we speak. And we are so glad to welcome him back today for the first part of a 2-part series called And Still We Rise, which is a reference to a Maya Angelou poem. Part 2 will be taking place on Friday, October 30th at 12 p.m. And as I mentioned, I will provide the handout that Bill has passed along to me, and you can download that if you wish. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Bill. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. William Thierfelder. Take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome. And as Jeff said, this is part 1 of a series called And Still We Rise. And thank you for that very nice intro, and we're going to move into here, hopefully. There we are. So we obviously can't possibly cover every aspect of Sojourner's life and accomplishments today. So what I'd like to suggest is that you go to my website, which is makingwings.net. And that's one word, makingwings.net. And if you click onto that, let's hope this works. Screen sharing has paused. So let me make sure that I can get that. Here we go. Hopefully now you are seeing this. This is my website. And if you go to the top where it says 2020 library programs, if you just click on Truth and Tubman, you'll be brought to a page that covers these 2 programs. And there are suggested books and media. There is, in this case, a biography of Sojourner Truth. There's one about Harriet a little further down. I don't want to make you too dizzy here. I provide a timeline and some other materials that relate to the topic, and then videos and articles and essays. So there is a lot of material here, and please feel free to avail yourself of that. Now we should be back to the PowerPoint screen, and I'm counting on you, Jeff. If something is going amiss, just let me know. So I would like to suggest some possible readings and this and media. And on this page, there are some that I do recommend very highly. If you are going to explore her life, start with a primary text, and that is Truth's 1850 autobiography. And I recommend the edition that you're seeing on your screen with a wonderful introduction by the Black historian Margaret Washington. There's also Nell Painter's 1996 biography that is an excellent overview of her life. And then as we're moving across the screen towards your right, you're going to see 2 books on top of each other. It's actually the same book. It's Pat and Fred McKissick's biography for Scholastic Books, which was first published in 1994 as Ain't I a Woman, and then in a revised version in 2002, A Voice for Freedom. And we'll actually be talking about that shift a little later in the program. Now, though this book is aimed for young adults, it's really a super biography. I also would like to recommend Margaret Washington, same Margaret Washington who wrote the intro for the narrative, her 2009 book called Sojourner Truth's America. And I find that it's especially relevant now in our current social and political scene that we are living in right now. The young reader's book, When Harriet Met Sojourner, recounts the one and only time that these 2 dynamic forces actually met face to face. And it's a good book. And again, though it's aimed at younger readers, I think it's a good read even for adults. Meanwhile, 3 DVDs that I recommend are The Life of Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman? The Phoenix Learning Group. It's about 26 minutes long. I've shown it in classes over the years. It's very good. Um, and it's available on Amazon and in many libraries. I totally recommend Up from Slavery. It's a 7-part series. And again, many libraries have this. And if you're interested in purchasing it for a personal library, I just discovered that Amazon is now selling it for $7. So, woohoo. And then there's the 2006 PBS documentary called One Woman, One Vote, that's narrated by Susan Sarandon. And that's because Sojourner Truth, in addition to abolition, was also very much involved in the women's movement of the 19th century. And again, all of these books and DVDs are cited on my website if you want to copy down the title or the author's name. So let's dive in. So when we discuss the life of Harriet Tubman in the next segment, we'll be exploring slavery in the South. But when we look at the life of Sojourner Truth, we're exploring slavery in a place that most people don't associate with the horrors of human bondage, and that's the North. Slavery in the North. When Sojourner was born in New York State in the late 1790s, there were still 2 northern states that had slavery, New Jersey and New York. Now, Jersey abolished slavery in 1804, but it wasn't until 1827 that slavery officially ended in New York State. So it might be helpful for you to know about slavery in the North, especially in New York. And I'm not going to tempt fate here by actually clicking on these links, but this is available on the website. And I've posted there 2 links from the New York Historical Society. So back in 2005, the New York Historical Society in Manhattan hosted a landmark exhibition called Slavery in New York. And the impact of that show was so powerful that the society chose to keep portions as part of their permanent collection. So you can visit the Society's website and discover all kinds of outstanding materials. If you go to the one that, and you can see here the name Slavery in New York, you can actually find illustrated educators' guides and all kinds of archival photographs and documents. And then this second one called Witnesses to History, Slavery in the Founding Era, that is an exhibition that's going on currently. And again, terrific resources. Again, you can find this on the website, or you can just Google Slavery in New York, New York Historical Society, and you'll be brought to those pages. So let's dive in. Sojourner was born somewhere around 1797 as Isabella Baumfree. We don't know her exact birth date because we don't have any official documents. And that's something that wasn't unusual. Sojourner is mentioned as property in certain later documents, but the details of her actual birth are a mystery. Her masters were a Dutch family in Ulster County in lower upstate New York. And I've included a little map over here to refresh our memory where Ulster County is. The family that she was owned by were the Hardenberg family, and they spoke only Dutch in their household, and it was actually Sojourner's first language. She didn't learn to speak English until she was at least 7 or 8 years old, and possibly even later. Now, think about that. Having slaves that couldn't speak English was actually an advantage, for it meant that they couldn't communicate with fellow slaves on nearby farms. It was definitely a way to keep slaves under control. So, very interesting aspect of Sojourner's life. Now, after the death of her owner, who was Charles Hardenberg, at that point, the first owner was Joseph, then Charles, the son, owned her. He dies, and Isabella, who is usually called Belle at this point, was sold for $100. Doesn't sound like a much in our money, but that was a pretty steep sum back in 1807, to a local English-speaking family who were called the Neelys. Now, she was about 7 or 8 at the time, and remember, she's only speaking Dutch. They only speak English. So needless to say, communications were difficult at the least, at best, I should say. And Belle was actually frequently beaten for insubordination because she wasn't doing her chores. Well, she didn't understand the directions that were being given to her. Well, finally, after a year of total frustrations, the Neelys sell Belle to the owners of a local tavern, the Scribers. And it's there that she picks up a lifelong habit of smoking a pipe. There are illustrations of her with a little corncob pipe. Again, things didn't go as smoothly as they might, and again, probably because of the difficulty with language. And the 11 or 12-year-old Belle is sold for $175 to John Dumont and his wife, Sally, in New Paltz, New York, a small town near the Hudson River, for those of you who aren't familiar. Well, she proved to be a very efficient slave, and something that really annoyed some of the less motivated slaves on the Dumont farm. And it also annoyed the wife, Sally Dumont, who realized that her husband, John, had perhaps more than a passing interest in the pubescent Belle. Well, about 5 years into her tenure at the Dumont farm, Belle met and fell in love with a slave from a neighboring farm. Now, his name was Robert, and his owner was a well-regarded regional painter named Charles Caton. When Caton found out about the relationship, he put an immediate stop to it because if Belle and Robert were to have children, the offspring would belong to the Dumonts. You see, it was pretty much a standard rule throughout the colonies that all children were property, and they were property of the mother's owner. Well, despite it all, Robert continued to sneak over to the Dumont farm to see Belle. Caton and his son discover this, and they start savagely beating Robert. And John Dumont happened to be near there and intervened. But he laid down the law then with Belle and said, "You can never see Robert again." And she doesn't. She never sees Robert again. And we do know from property records, interestingly enough, not a death certificate, but from property records, that Robert actually died within a few years of this experience. So it was a totally traumatic experience for the teenage Belle, and it's one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. I want to just say something very briefly about this painting that you're seeing as the screen background. It's a painting of George Washington. It's by an unknown painter. It was painted sometime in the late 1700s. Now we know that Washington actually dies in 1799, so this is a little bit of a chronological disconnect here, putting this on this screen. But I wanted to include it because I want, again, to remind you that slavery was something throughout the colonies, and that some of our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, etc., owned slaves. Now, of course, there were those who were against slavery, like Ben Franklin. In fact, he starts an abolitionist society in Pennsylvania. But this experience of, Belle being, owned as a slave in upstate New York in the early 1800s, no, this is not unusual. This is part of our country's fabric. Well, for the next decade, Belle remains under the watchful eye of John Dumont, who finally forces her to marry one of his older slaves by the name of Thomas. And the reasons, of course, are economic. Children from the union would become property, and property would mean more wealth. So over a 9-year period, Tom and Belle have at least 5 children that we know of. The first of which, Diana, may have actually been the result of a rape committed by John Dumont prior to the marriage with Tom. This is something that scholars are starting to explore. After Diana, we know of 4 other children. Peter, born probably around 1821, Elizabeth around 1825. There was a daughter named Hannah. We don't know anything about her birth date. It's still a mystery. And Sophia, who was born probably around 1826. And again, remember that all of these children are the property of John Dumont on his plantation in Ulster County, New York. Well, now it's 1826, and it proves to be a very pivotal year for Belle, who was at this point somewhere around 19 years old. All New York-owned slaves were supposed to be freed in 1827. But John Dumont promised Belle that he would free her in 1826 if she worked, quote unquote, extra hard, whatever that phrase might imply. Apparently, she fulfilled her end of the bargain, but Dumont refused to free her. Possibly it was a power play. We really don't know why he doesn't do it. But Sojourner makes a monumental choice to leave her husband and 4 of her children and to take her nursing daughter, Sophia, to live with a local abolitionist Quaker family in New Paltz, Isaac and Maria van Wagenen. Again, another Dutch family. She probably could speak Dutch with them. And the Wagenens buy Belle from Dumont, thus ending her official servitude in 1826, which is what she wanted. Well, by 1827, all slaves in New York were free, but Sojourner and her husband agreed to remain separate. I mean, they were just brought together for convenience for Dumont. They never really loved each other, wasn't really much of a marriage. And they agreed to stay separate. So for the time, Sophia remains with Belle, and the 4 other children remain with the Dumonts. And on your screen, you can see pictures of that Van Wagenen estate, which you can still visit if you go upstate to the New Paltz area. Well, 1828 becomes another remarkable year for Belle. Because what happens is that Belle discovers that year that Dumont is involved in the sale of her son Peter to a plantation owner in Alabama. Now, the case is a little bit more complicated than that. And again, if you go to my website, you can see there are more people involved than just Dumont, but he's the instigator. And with the help of several people, including the Van Wagenens, an absolutely infuriated Belle successfully sues for the return of her child. And her legal defense is a simple one. New York State now had a law forbidding the interstate sale of people as slaves. Her success in the Ulster County Courthouse, and I have pictures of it up there for you, which is in Kingston, New York, becomes the first case in American history in which a Black woman successfully challenged a white man in a United States court. And if you go to that courthouse in Kingston, there is actually a plaque which talks about this particular very famous case. So she gets her son Peter, who's about 6 years old, gets him back, and in that year of 1828, They leave the Van Wagenens, they leave Ulster County, and they move to New York City, where they live with a family called the Gears. She spends much of the next decade there. And she actually lives with a number of families and earns her living as a maid and doing menial jobs. Sadly, Peter becomes an increasingly troubled teenager. And after some training, he leaves her to become a ship's hand. Remember, she does not know how to read or write. So she dictates letters to people to send to Peter on the ships that he's on and, hoping for some answer. And she actually only hears back from him 3 times. From some letters written over a decade later, 1839, and another letter, a couple letters in 1841, when he is sailing aboard a ship called the Zone of Nantucket. When that ship returns to New York Harbor, I have a background of that, the South Street Seaport here, he wasn't on board, and there was no records of his whereabouts. And she has no idea whatever happened to that son, Peter, whom she had fought to get back, right, from slavery. He disappears from her life. He disappears from historical records. We have no idea what happens to Peter. We'll move forward to 1835. And again, I mean, this is thumbnail sketch. If you want more detail, please visit the website. 1835, another remarkable year. And here's this story. Again, very interesting story. So starting in the early 1830s, Belle started to work as a housekeeper for a Christian evangelist by the name of Elijah Pearson. She then moved on to the home of Robert Matthews. Again, we're not quite sure why, but she moves to another man, another family. His name is Robert Matthews, and he's actually known as the Prophet Matthias. He's kind of the equivalent of, this is an Elmer Gantry, this is a televangelist. And she works for him, this Robert Matthews, also as a domestic. Well, shortly after Truth started to work for Matthews, her first employer, Elijah Pearson, dies. Matthews was accused of poisoning Pearson, who, by the way, may have been seen as a rival. Modern scholars have very little doubt that Matthews actually did poison Pearson. Now, the Folger family, who were a couple who were members of Matthews' cult, unsuccessfully attempted to implicate Belle in the crime. They're kind of saying that Matthews made Belle poison, that there's a poisoning there, and they try to, make her the guilty one who poisoned this fellow religious person, Elijah Pearson. Well, in the absence of adequate evidence, Matthews is acquitted, and because of the adverse publicity, Matthews moves west. But in 1835, Belle brings a slander suit against the Folgers, and she wins. She wins $125 in damages. And again, that's a pretty hefty sum in 1835. And it becomes the first time an African-American had won such a case. So Sojourner was a legal trailblazer, not just once, but twice in her lifetime. And stay tuned, there's a third time that's going to come up a little later in this program. Well, then comes 1843, big year. So for the rest of the 1830s and the early 1840s, Belle continued to perform housekeeping for various New York families. Her daughters were grown and married, they were starting families, and it looked as though she would spend the rest of her life in the rut in which most Black women found themselves. But something happened on June 1st of 1843. During one of her regular morning meditation periods, she thought she heard the voice of God telling her to move on. For her, it was a very real and remarkable experience. So that day, she handed in her notice to the Whiting family, for whom she was working at the time, and left New York City for good, determined to head north and then east into Massachusetts to preach the word of God. She herself decided, I will become a evangelist, a preacher, a missionary. So that evening, she finds herself at rest in the home of a Quaker family in the Hudson Valley. And in her narrative, she says that when the family asked what her name was, she replied that it was Sojourner, a traveler. And when they asked what her last name was, she thought for a moment, and she had to think. Because like most former slaves and free domestics, a person's last name, a Black person's last name, was the name of his or her owner. She had been a Hardenberg, she had been a Dumont, she had been a Van Wagenen, she had been a Whiting, but now she was free to choose her own name. So after thinking, after a moment's thought, she says, you know, the only master I have now is God, and his name is Truth. Sojourner Truth is my name, because from this day forward, I walk in the light of his truth. So she's about 46 years old when she goes from being Isabella Baumfree to Sojourner Truth. She's about 46, and it's a whole new chapter of her life. And she spends the next several years traveling around the East Coast as an itinerant preacher. And along the way, she meets several influential abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, on the left side of your screen, and William Lloyd Garrison, on the right, who were deeply impressed by her story, as she was of theirs. And she began to see that part of her evangelical mission was to preach about freedom and the sin of slavery. So, by 1846, Sojourner is fully committed to ending slavery. She travels around the country, which at that time went as far west as the states bordering the Mississippi River, lecturing about abolition. But she also picks up other causes and becomes a fierce advocate for women's rights, including the right to vote, and for prison reform. And it's during this particular period that she becomes friends with other important women leaders like Susan B. Anthony, over to the left, Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the middle, and the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, over to the right. And she's going to prove important in a moment in this story. But I'm going to do a little sidebar here. Because to understand some of the rest of Sojourner's story, and we're going to see this in a few weeks when we discuss Harriet Tubman, same thing. This Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 proves really important. But I want to give you a little background. By the time the United States Constitutional Convention in 1787 was meeting, many northern states, including Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, had already abolished slavery. Now, as you know, New Jersey and New York still were in the mix. And concerned that these new free states would become safe havens for runaway slaves, Southern politicians, as well as a few from New York and New Jersey, insisted that the Constitution include a fugitive slave clause. And there is. So in the Constitution, you have Article 4, which states that no person held in service or labor would be released from bondage in the event that they escaped to a free state. So even if you move to, let's say, Vermont, you're still a slave, and the owner could come and collect you. Well, to strengthen the intent of the constitutional article, the first Fugitive Slave Act, which is passed in Congress in 1793, authorized local governments to seize and return escaped slaves to their owners, and imposed penalties on anyone who aided their flight. So that's an addition. And of course, there was widespread resistance, especially in the free states of New York. In New York and New Jersey, not so much. Well, by 1850, and by this point, New York and New Jersey are now firmly entrenched as non-slave northern states. That act of 1850 then is technically the second Fugitive Slave Act, and actually the third act that deals with this topic. The second act added further provisions regarding runaways and levied even harsher punishments for interfering in their capture. The 1850 Act, of course, was met with even more impassioned criticism and resistance than any earlier measures. States, in fact, like Vermont and Wisconsin, passed new laws intended to bypass and even nullify the act, and abolitionists redoubled their efforts to assist runaway slaves. So that's a little bit of a background that's important, not only in our discussion of Sojourner, but also in 3 weeks when we discuss Harriet. So we move forward, and we move into Sojourner's life in that year of 1850. Many of the chief abolitionists felt that Sojourner's story would be an important one for people to know. But because she can't read or write, she dictates her story to an abolitionist friend named Olive Gilbert. You can see her over on the left side of your screen. It's published as The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. And notice the subtitle, A Northern Slave. And again, emphasizing, even at that time, that slavery wasn't just a Southern experience, that it at one time had also existed in the North. It has a foreword by William Lloyd Garrison, who had written the introduction to Frederick Douglass's narrative in 1845. She makes enough money from the sale of her book to buy a home in Northampton, Massachusetts, which she uses as a headquarters for her abolitionist work and for her support of the Underground Railroad, which, refresh our memory, is a movement which was helping to transport slaves from the South into freedom in the northern states in Canada. And that's where we're going to connect the next time with Harriet Tubman, of course. So by the time the second edition of Sojourner's Slave Narrative is published in 1855, the first edition sold out, so there's a second edition in 1855. This time, the foreword is by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who by this point was famous for her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin that had been published in 1852. So quite a pedigree there, remarkable. So she becomes famous through this book. Now, if her work as a dynamic speaker was making her a household name, as well as her book, among the abolitionists, it was her 1851 speech to the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron that put her on the pages of the nation's newspapers. Truth delivered an improvised speech that was recorded by several observers. And over time, that speech would become widely printed and known by the title, Ain't I a Woman? Now, the first version of the speech, and you can see it in the upper right corner of your screen, was published in June of 1851, shortly after the convention, by Marius Robinson, who was the editor of an Ohio abolitionist paper called the Anti-Slavery Bugle. And in that transcription, never once did it include that phrase, ain't I a woman? That phrase, that very famous phrase, would appear in print 12 years later in May of 1863 at the height of the Civil War. It was used as a refrain of an expanded Southern-tinged version of the speech published by Frances Gage, who was a leading American reformer, feminist, abolitionist, and more about her in just a moment. The reality is that Sojourner Truth, who's a native of New York, whose first language was Dutch, would never have spoken in that kind of Southern idiom. But it made for good press, and ultimately Truth more than likely didn't object to it if it served a good purpose. Now, let's read a portion of this speech as kind of recreated by Francis Gage in 1863. That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Well, to put it bluntly, Francis Gage exaggerated, even invented facts such as Sojourner having 13 children. It was for effect, to support the cause of women's suffrage and partly to rally the troops after the publication of the Emancipation Proclamation earlier that year in January of 1863. Well, despite the inaccuracies, and I'm putting that in air quotes there, Gage's version of the speech made Sojourner a rock star in many circles, and Sojourner apparently went along probably because it helped the cause. But, and if you look over on the right, remember those two books I showed you at the very beginning? Modern scholars like the McKissicks, whose book I recommended earlier, are now rethinking our perception of that rightfully important 1851 speech and focusing on its content rather than the fabricated language or exaggerated aspects of the 1863 version. So moving forward a few years, another pivotal moment happens in 1857 when Sojourner decides to sell her Massachusetts home. She reunites with 3 of her daughters and their families, Diana, Elizabeth, and Sophia, and they all move lock, stock, and barrel to Harmonia, Michigan. And just as a little sideline here, you may remember there was another child, we don't know about a birth date, her name was Hannah. Some scholars wonder whether Hannah was even Sojourner's child. So we don't know much about that child, but we do know that 3 of those daughters, Diana, Elizabeth, and Sophia, move to Harmonia with mom, separate homes, of course. And they moved to this place called Harmonia, which, like Brook Farm back in Massachusetts, was a utopist community. It was established by Quaker pioneers who had converted to spiritualism. Now, this was a religious movement that swept across the country in the years before and during the Civil War. They believed, among other things, that the spirits of the dead existed and could actually communicate with the living. So on this slide, you can see one of the local churches in the Harmonia community, as well as a photo that I was able to find that shows the gravestone of Sophia's daughter, Sojourner's daughter, Sophia, the one that she had run away with back in 1826. You'll notice on this gravestone that they list the date as 1821. Some scholars think it was 1826. So again, these dates are all very peculiar. We do know that she died in 1901. During the 1860s, Sojourner travels hundreds of miles and gives speeches on behalf of women's rights, about the end of slavery. Her children and their families stay in this Harmonia area, the Battle Creek Harmonia area. Harmonia is near Battle Creek, Michigan. I've included here on this page a little map that I found in a local Battle Creek, Michigan newspaper archives, the things you can do on Google, right? Uh, and it indicates the location of her home in Harmonia. I've marked it in a little bit of the yellow there, and you can see Sojourner Truth's home. I also found in the archives, and this is a wonderful photograph. This is a photograph of her oldest daughter, Diana, who lived to at least 88 years of age. We know that she dies in 1904. Again, her birth date, little suspect. And I put her photo side by side with that of her mother. Right? There's Sojourner, there's Diana. So that you can see that she too dressed in the traditional Quaker style, the shawl over the shoulder, the bonnet, and the hair. It's a beautiful homage to her mother. Well, here's a fun story. During the height of the Civil War, we find more evidence of Sojourner's near rock star status. And it involves a very famous piece of sculpture, which is housed in several major American art museums, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A picture of that sculpture, which I took last October when I was in New York, is on the right side of your screen. Now here's the story. Very thoughtful pose, right? In 1863, William Wentworth Story created an award-winning statue named the Libyan Sibyl. A Sibyl was a seer and a prophetess. As was the custom of the day, several copies of the statue were made, and it becomes very well known. It's also photographed and seen in newspapers, so it's a very well known statue. And why is it so well known? Because it's loosely based upon a conversation that the sculptor had with Harriet Beecher Stowe about Sojourner Truth. As the tale goes, Story was inspired by Sojourner's life, and he created the statue. The tale was further amplified when, in 1863, same year as the statue, Harriet Beecher Stowe published an account of a visit that she had had with Sojourner. And in that essay, Stowe romanticizes Sojourner as a quote unquote, an African full of wisdom. Well, this article by Harriet Beecher Stowe becomes the inspiration for William Story to create this statue, the Libyan Sibyl. So once Stowe's article was published and photos of Story's statue were circulated and people started seeing it in museums, in the public's eye, the identification of Sojourner with Story's Libyan Sibyl became almost universal. And newspapers started to refer to Truth as the Sibyl. And even Sojourner came to describe herself as, quote, Mrs. Stowe's well-known Libyan Sibyl. So she went along with this. I kind of find it ironic because the sculpture is certainly a white man's image of an African. And it's very Greco-Roman, but that's a discussion for another day. White people's artistic interpretations of Black people, but that's another story. But anyway, she became known as the Libyan Sibyl. Now, in the following year, in August of 1864, Sojourner, who was about 68 years old at the time, had her one and only encounter with Harriet Tubman, who was about 42 years old. There's about a quarter century difference in their ages. Harriet is born in 1822. Sojourner is born somewhere like 1797. In his book, Sojourner Truth, Slave, Prophet, and Legend, Carlton Mabie writes, quote, Truth tried to persuade Tubman that Abraham Lincoln was a real friend to blacks, but Tubman insisted he was not because he allowed black soldiers to be paid less than white, unquote. Well, if you know the history of black regiments in the Civil War, or if you've seen films like Glory, you're aware that black soldiers did receive half the pay of their white soldier counterparts. And this infuriated people like Tubman, who refused to meet with Lincoln. Sojourner took a more measured, something is better than nothing approach to the issue. Now, as we'll learn when we explore the life of Harriet Tubman in a few weeks, Tubman never did meet President Lincoln. But apparently, she did consent to have tea with Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, on at least one occasion. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall during that one, or to paraphrase the song from the musical Hamilton, I wanted to be in the room where that happened. Well, as the war ground on, and also in 1864, Sojourner was invited by Lincoln to come to Washington, D.C. to work with the newly formed Freedmen's Bureau, whose purpose was to help former slaves build new lives as free men and women. Sojourner and other abolitionists like Frederick Douglass realized that, once a person is freed, wow, he or she'd have to have all kinds of resources to navigate that new life. Former slaves needed to learn how to read and write. They had to be able to secure employment. They needed a place to live. So this bureau was an early attempt to address that pressing issue. And while in Washington, we know that Sojourner met with President Lincoln at least once, and that was in October of 1864. And at that visit, she asked if he would sign her autograph book, which contained the signatures of many famous people. Lincoln took the book, and with the same hand that he had signed the death warrant on slavery in 1863, he wrote, and this is how he signs the book, "For Auntie Sojourner Truth, October 29, 1864, A. Lincoln." And became one of her most prized possessions, that autograph by Abraham Lincoln. Now, I absolutely love the next part of her story. Just because the war ended didn't mean that Sojourner slowed down. So in 1865, now this is a century before Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin, Sojourner attempted to force desegregation of the Washington, D.C. streetcar system. These were horse-drawn streetcars. When a new law in March of 1865 forbade streetcars to exclude anyone on account of color, few blacks still dared to ride the streetcar. They still felt very wary of it. But Truth did dare, and when a conductor slammed her against a door in an attempt to put her off the car, she had him arrested, brought him to trial, and she won her case. So this story was widely covered in the press, and this is the one that proves to be the third time that Truth successfully takes a case to court. The first, you may remember, was her son Peter. The second was the slander case, and she wins. So despite this placid exterior, the little old lady with the shawl over her shoulders and the little bonnet in her hair, be not fooled. She was a formidable person willing to fight for justice. So in 1867, Sojourner moved from Harmonia into a larger home, a converted barn in Battle Creek. Picture there on the right side of your screen. And she uses that as a headquarters for ongoing work as a feminist, a suffragist, a prohibitionist, a prison reformist. And she travels, she continues travels. And one of the places that she loved to travel to was Rochester, New York, home of Frederick Douglass for many years. And also visiting places in Reconstruction South, And in both places, she tried to help resettle freed slaves. And during this period, she also continues to develop her friendship with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's a fellow suffragist. Let's push forward to 1870. So she's now well into her 70s, but she continues her active speaking, focusing on venues in New York, New Jersey, New England. And her topics cover a wide range: prohibition, tobacco use, even though she still occasionally smoked her pipe on the sly, I guess. She spoke about fashionable dress, and a very new focus, providing freedmen with land in the West of the Mississippi, to restart their lives. In fact, in 1870, she pleaded her case with President Grant, and then appeared in the U.S. Senate chambers to, I like to call it, work the crowd, as it were. Senators were in awe of her and gladly signed her autograph book that she had kept over the years. That's the one Lincoln had signed, which she called her Book of Life. Little background here, that in recent years, this book, which was maintained, that book has actually toured the country and has now found a home in the Sojourner Truth Library on the campus of the University of New York in New Paltz. Now, I'm sure that Sojourner would appreciate the irony of having a library at a university named after a woman who couldn't read or write. But she was often quoted as saying, and I love this line, "I can't read books, but oh, I can read people." I love that. I can't read books, but oh, I can read people. So during the remainder of her life, Sojourner continued to work for the rights of women, especially the right to vote, the rights of former slaves, and she becomes an impassioned advocate for securing land grants from the federal government for former slaves west of the Mississippi. Her argument is, you have all this land out there, why don't you give chunks of it to people who are the freed slaves? You know, they deserve to have a place to begin a life as farmers or whatever. Sadly, she was never able to sway Congress, though she tried many, many times over the years. If you want to put it in a modern equivalency, she's kind of was the equivalent of a modern day lobbyist working the halls of Congress. And she did this right until the year of her death, which comes in 1883. Sojourner's long and remarkable life ends on November 26th of that year. She had suffered that year a series of leg infections that couldn't be treated. She even went to the famous Battle Creek Sanitarium of Dr. John Kellogg, a name we probably all know. She finally was sent home, and she died peacefully in her home November 26th. Now, I found a picture of her gravestone for you. You'll notice that the gravestone claims that she was 105 years old. Well, most scholars now put her age at between 86 and 90. Well, whatever the case may be, her long life surely is an inspiration. Now, before I hear from you, I'd love to end with this terrific quote. "Life is a hard battle anyway. If we laugh and sing a little as we fight the good fight of freedom, it makes it all go easier. I will not allow my life's light to be determined by the darkness around me." Oh my gosh, right? Isn't that last line just terrific? I will not allow my life's light to be determined by the darkness around me. And certainly during the difficult times that we are living through right now, politically, socially, racially, medically, wow, those are truly words to live by, aren't they? So As I've said, we've only done a sketch of Sojourner's life. And again, for a deeper look, I really invite you to go to my website, makingwings.net. Hey, I've made a meal for you, please, manja.